Hi everyone, welcome back to the Facts of Life lecture series. We're now going to round out our discussion of animals by talking about the more derived groups. So if you remember, the last thing we talked about were these segmented worms in the annelids. Now we're moving in and we're going to talk about arthropods, there are two major innovations that happened in the evolution of arthropods. The first is the development of an exoskeleton. So exo means outside, so skeleton outside the body. And in arthropods, what we have is chitin, which is a really strong material that's also found in the cell walls of fungi. Chitin and protein is deposited on the outside of every other segment. And that's important for movement. That is not every segment. The exoskeleton can support bodies and muscle attachments, but only if the animal is not large. So you'll sometimes hear people say, oh, if this kind of insect was as big as a human, it would be this strong. That's not actually going to be possible because the exoskeleton has some limits. Then we can get to movement. There's flexible movement allowed because those hardened segments of the exoskeleton are, it only happens every other segment. So it's called sclerotization when you have the hardened part. And this picture of honeypot ants demonstrates this issue. So you can see that this is an extreme example. This is the exact same genetic material in this ant and this ant. But what's happened is these are called repletes, where they're able to feed on a bunch of sugar water, and those unsclerotized parts of their abdomen can expand, while the sclerotized segments actually stay quite rigid. And so you see this in all arthropods where you have a sclerotized and a non-sclerotized part of their exoskeleton that allows for movement. So the exoskeleton can protect arthropods from predators. They have spikes, they have hard shells. There are colors that are used as camouflage so that they're not detected by predators, or as warning if they have some sort of toxic substance that is distasteful to predators. They want to go ahead and let those predators know using warning coloration so the predators don't try to eat them and get that toxin. And in order to repair and replace an exoskeleton, many insects will molt if they're younger, or they can increase the deposition. They can increase their exoskeleton by depositing minerals outside their body. And you also see that in things like snails. Okay, so the other big innovation that comes when we go from annelids to arthropods is jointed appendages. And so you can see that here in the legs and arms and feet. You can also see it in antennae. And there's a huge diversity of ways that arthropods use their jointed appendages, and it just allows for greater diversity of form, and that greater diversity of form leads to greater diversity of function. Arthropods are really important in terms of the diversity of animals, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. So we already talked about how they co-diversified with plants. But this is just showing the different groups of arthropods that we're aware of. So insects are just one part of the diversity of arthropods. They're an important part, as you can see in this figure, which is a scaled drawing of different groups on the planet. So different orders. What we have here is the size of the organism in this picture represents the number of species that we have of that group. So you can see that the bird is much smaller than the mushroom. The mammal is quite tiny. That's it. The biggest by far is insects. They are a huge proportion of the diversity of animal life. And within insects, there are a few key innovations I want to talk about. There's a lot of different innovations within insects, but once we get here to dragonflies and damselflies, there's flight. And everything after dragonflies and damselflies, all these other organisms basically had that one evolution towards flight, and kind of made more sophisticated innovations within their groups. Whoops. One interesting group I wanted to point out was termites. So people a lot of times think that termites are close relatives of ants, and they're not terribly far in the phylogeny, but they're quite distantly related. And actually the closest relative to termites is cockroaches. So really, this is relatively recent. In the last 15 years or so, we've realized that termites are essentially just truly social or eusocial cockroaches. And then the other innovation that we'll talk about is right here, and that is complete metamorphosis, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. So let's start with flight. Insect flight is a big part of the reason that we have successful diversification of insects. And within these groups, there's a lot of species. So we look at beetles. We've got over about 400,000 described species. Wasps, ants, and bees have about 200,000 described species. And it says so far because people are still finding more tiny little wasps, especially in places like tropical forest canopies. We've got about 5,000 species of dragonflies and damselflies, about 200,000 species of butterflies and moths, 125,000 species of flies, and that's another group where when people do surveys in these hyperdiverse tropical forest canopies and other places that haven't received as much study, they're finding new species of flies. And we have grasshoppers and their relatives with about 60,000 species. So really diverse, and this isn't all of insects, of course, but they all share in common this evolution of flight, and they do it in some different ways. So beetles have hardened forewings that are called elytra. So really all their flight is happening with just their hind wings, which is one reason that they're pretty poor flyers. Wasps, bees, and ants have both wings, although in the case of ants, some casts actually don't have any wings at all, but the reproductives do. Dragonflies and damselflies have this distinctive shape of their wings. Butterflies and moths obviously have taken their forewings and their hind wings and added all these very colorful scales and really innovated that way. In contrast to beetles, flies actually do all their flying with their forewings, and then they have these little tiny stunted hind wings that are now called halteres that just basically buttress their forewings. And grasshoppers are kind of midway between what the wings look like in a wasp and what the wings look like in a beetle. So there's some hardening of that shell, but there's more flexibility than we see for beetles in their elytra. But as I said, dragonflies were the first group of organisms within the arthropods to evolve flight. And all of the different kinds of flight have evolved from dragonfly flight. So you can go to this URL, or you can click on the link in the in the module to see some biomechanics of how dragonflies fly. And the second innovation I wanted to talk about within arthropods is complete metamorphosis, and this is actually within insects. So we have what's called holometabolis, or complete metamorphosis, or hemimetabolis, or incomplete metamorphosis. So metamorphosis is a change, and the more basal version of metamorphosis was here, where we have these eggs. Often they're housed in egg sacs, and we have the individual that comes out of the egg is basically a tiny version of the adult, usually without the wings developed, that goes through multiple nymphal stages until the final stage is this adult that can fly. Now, some of the most successful and most diverse groups of insects have holometabolis, or complete metamorphosis, where they hatch out into these larvae, and they go through multiple stages of larvae. They're called instars, and then pupate. They form this protective shell using their skin, and then completely reorganize their bodies to form the adult structures. And what often happens when an organism has complete metamorphosis is that it can specialize in feeding as an adult and feeding as a larva and reproduction as an adult. So it's really quite interesting. Okay, so now we get into the next group, which is our tunicates. Oh, I'm sorry, before we get to tunicates, echinoderms, like sea stars. So that's when we first start seeing a skeleton on the inside, or an endoskeleton. These develop when cartilage and bone is deposited just during development. And what happens with internal skeletons is that they can support much larger bodies and more powerful muscle attachments. And movement occurs by muscles pulling on those internal bones. The skeleton doesn't provide a ton of protection from predators, but it does allow animals to use those muscle attachments to move quickly so they can move away from predators. They're really hard. The endoskeleton is really hard to repair, and because it does usually happen during development. Interestingly, an endoskeleton contains its own blood supply. So tunicates were the first group that had a notochord. So when we talk about chordates, tunicates are our first big group that is a chordate. And so these are really interesting animals because they look a lot like a sponge, but they're much more derived organisms. They have the solid cylinder that forms during embryonic development. And because that cylinder is in the center, it allows for the development of a vertebral column eventually, and a neural tube. And so it allows more complex body designs. It allows more specialization in different parts of the body. And you can see that this is what their the mobile life stage looks like. So it's much more complicated than what you saw when we learned about sponges. This is a chordate phylogeny. So similar to arthropods, there's a lot of really important innovations that come that we're going to talk some more about. Sharks and their relatives have a vertebrae now, but it's completely composed of cartilage, so it's not as strong as bone, even though they have pretty powerful muscle attachments. After sharks, we get into jointed limbs. So this is an example of convergent evolution. So this happens separately in chordates and arthropods. But for both, the articulation in jointed appendages allowed for functional diversity. And we got lots of different kinds of movement. I mean, you look at the similar body plan that for humans, horses, cats, bats, birds, and whales that all do really different kinds of movement. And so this was an important innovation. And the hypothesis here is that we had a lobe-finned fish that ended up getting webbed feet as an early amphibian. And there's actually some fossil evidence of this, these structures in prehistoric amphibians that then led to what we see in modern day frogs and salamanders. Next we get to birds and reptiles, and their innovation is amniotic eggs. So we're all pretty familiar with bird eggs. Lizard eggs are pretty similar, although they have a few differences, like this leathery skin. But basically, amniotic eggs allowed birds, reptiles, and mammals to lay eggs away from water, because they're coming with their own water source. And so this really allowed flexibility. You know, we talked about seeds as being important for plants getting away from water and onto land. The same is true for eggs and animals. Eggs also include yolk as a food source. They have protection from abiotic conditions because they have the shell. In mammals, they're inside, so that protection is a little different. But in birds and reptiles, the shell is really protecting the developing embryo. And they have shock absorbance in the amnion. In mammals, we get another innovation, and that is milk. So the mammary glands are characteristic of almost all mammals, although there's some derived exceptions, including platypus and echidna. The mammary glands, interestingly enough, are probably derived from sweat glands and arose in an ancestor that predated modern mammals. So mammals have had mammary glands for quite some time. And really, if you think about it, provisioning young with milk allows females that have a lot of parental care to feed their babies when resources are unpredictable. And this figure here is how much fat is in different organisms' breast milk. And you can see that humans are kind of right smack dab in the middle. So there are some, like whales and elephants, that have quite a bit more fat, and there are some like bison and antelope that have less. Okay, so that's all I have for this lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions using the discussions tab of Canvas, or you can always come to my office hours in my WebEx room and email me if you need to meet at a different time. Thank you for your attention. Bye.